Hi everyone. Tonight, we're going to explore the stone corridors of an old castle. The torches flicker along the walls, and you can almost hear the soft sound of the wind sneaking through the cracks in the thick wooden doors. It's a romantic setting, perfect for tourists. But if you actually had to live here, especially on a winter's night, you would probably regret it before the first hour was over. The truth is straightforward. Castles were very cold. If you had to sleep inside one of these buildings without central heating, windows that kept the cold out, or even a decent mattress, you'd quickly discover that your biggest enemy wasn't the other knights. It was the cold. You probably won't make it. You can do it, but you'll need to know a few tricks. So, before you get comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening right now, please write your location and the time there in the comments. I love seeing where in the world my listeners are from. Now, turn off the bright lights, relax, and picture yourself getting ready for bed in a medieval castle. You walk slowly across the stone floor of a big room. Your boots make noises as they touch the surfaces that have been made smooth by many people walking on them for hundreds of years. You can still feel the cold biting your skin, even though you're wearing lots of clothes. The stone walls don't just stop the warmth from getting through. They soak it up. Castles are often seen as amazing constructions for defending against attackers, but not so much for making life comfortable for the people living in them. Here's the truth, plain and simple. Those thick walls could protect against a battering ram, and they also trap cold air like a giant refrigerator. When it got dark, it got really cold inside, almost as quickly as it got cold outside. You would notice your breath forming clouds in front of your face. The air inside feels heavy, damp, and unwelcoming. Castles were built to keep out enemies, not to keep the cold out. The architects thought about moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits, but they didn't plan for insulation. A well-known fact that is worth remembering was that because a lot of castles in Northern Europe were built on hills where the wind would often blow strongly. From a military point of view, that was great. You could see the invaders coming, and the slopes made it easier to defend yourself. But from a perspective of someone trying to get some sleep, it was terrible. The wind was so strong that it scraped every surface and pushed icy gusts through the gaps in the shutters and under the doors. You couldn't find a worse place to sleep. You might think the fireplaces would keep you safe, but this is not true. Even a roaring fire in the Great Hall didn't keep people warm. The further away from the flames you got, the colder it got. By the time you made your way to your bedroom, it felt more like you were in a cellar than a living room. Here's something a bit unusual. Some old records from the late medieval period tell us that travelers were very surprised to find frost inside castles. Imagine waking up to icicles hanging from your bed curtains, or finding that the sink is completely frozen. Chronicles didn't think this was a big deal. It's just something that happened. If your chamber didn't have a thin layer of rime on the walls in January, you were in the minority. But people survived all the same. They found a way to stop their bodies from melting. One part of the survival instinct was the practice of rituals. When it got dark, families did things to keep warm. The castle is very big, but people always made sure to use as little of it as possible at night. Fires were made, beds were arranged with curtains, clothes were layered until mobility was less important, and everyone hoped the draft wouldn't be too cold. Imagine you're walking into a medieval bedroom. The bed is very impressive. It is raised high off the floor. That wasn't a matter of style. The plan was to get away from the coldest part of the air, which always goes down. Even so, the stone feels cold when you climb under the covers. Historians still argue about whether castles became more comfortable over time or whether stories about them being cozy and noble were exaggerated by later storytellers. Some people think that tapestries and thick curtains can make a room feel warmer. Others say that the room always feels cold, no matter how many fabrics you hang on the walls. The truth is most likely somewhere in the middle. Things got a little better but not enough to be really comfortable. You lie back in this made-up bed, the wooden frame making a noise as the bedding moves around. Outside, the wind is loud. It is blowing against the castle walls. The only light is from a small oil lamp that is very weak and near the bed. Your toes are already starting to hurt from the cold, even though you're still wearing your day clothes. Then you can hear the sounds of a night from a castle. The sound of footsteps on stone as a guard changes their watch. The creaking of rafters under the frost. A dog barks quietly in the courtyard, its voice hidden by the thick walls. You might hear the sound of water freezing somewhere close by. None of it will make you feel any warmer. Instead, it reminds you that the world outside is tough. It's easy to imagine the nobility being comfortable and warm, while the peasants are freezing in their cottages. But here's the funny thing. Sometimes ordinary people had a better life. Their homes, built of wood and stone, might trap heat from the hearth more efficiently than the big, open rooms of a lord's castle. A small fire in a hut could keep a family warm. But you, a noble in a castle, could shiver in a stone box so big that even 5 fireplaces wouldn't make it any warmer. People at the time understood the irony. Some of the letters that have survived mention how hard it was to sleep well in castles during the winter. They described their homes, built of wood and stone, might trap heat from the hearth more efficiently than the big, open rooms of a lord's castle. A small fire in a hut could keep a family warm. But you, a noble in a castle, could shiver in a stone box so big that even 5 fireplaces wouldn't make it any warmer. People at the time understood the irony. Some of the letters that have survived mention how hard it was to sleep well in castles during the winter. They say the beds are great, but the nights are very cold. Some people even tell travelers to pack extra cloaks. They do this not for show, but for survival. As you keep imagining yourself lying there, you start to understand how hard it must have been to get through the night. You didn't just lie under a blanket and hope for the best. You put on thick clothes, put up thick fur rugs, pulled the curtains tight, and sometimes even slept in the same bed as other people, whether they were human or not. Each step was about creating small areas of warmth in a place designed by nature and architecture, despite the relentless cold. The experience affects how you think about medieval life. These people were more than just fighters, rulers, religious people, and young women. They were people who wanted to survive. Going to bed was difficult every night, and every winter was hard. Sleep, which we now think of as an easy treat, had to be made carefully with habits that have been passed down through the years. Think about how thankful you would be for every bit of warmth, the sudden comfort of a dog pressed against your feet, the fun of hot stones placed near your bed, and the small success of keeping frost off your beard through the night. These moments would be much more memorable for you than any meal or hunting trip. Survival was memorable. Tonight, as you lie in your modern bed, enjoying the comfort of the central heating, you can think about those who once slept in cold stone chambers. They had long nights and bitter mornings, but they got through it. They found a way to sleep in places that should have been unlivable. We will keep exploring this story bit by bit with new ideas. You will feel like you are in the middle of the medieval night. You are now in the main hall of the castle. This is the most important room in any medieval castle. If the bedchamber was a stone tomb, this place is at least alive with the warmth of life. Long tables stretch across the floor. Their wooden surfaces are shiny from people touching them. The air has a strong smell of roasted meat, stale beer, damp wool, and smoke. The fire in the middle of the room is bright and fiery, like a square of orange light against the dark winter night. This is where the castle felt most alive after dark. People came here for food and to get as much warmth as possible before going back inside. Servants run quickly back and forth, carrying large amounts of bread, beer, and big plates of hot soup. Dogs are scavenging for food on the ground, tails wagging. The hall is very noisy. There's lots of laughter, music, and the sound of knives hitting plates. You might forget for a moment that there's wind outside and frost is starting to form on the windows. Here is the truth. The Great Hall was the only part of most castles where it was possible to make the building warm enough to be comfortable. There was a big open hearth in the middle or at the end of the room, and people fed the fire almost constantly during the winter. Sometimes whole tree trunks were brought in to keep it going. If you had a high rank, you sat near it, feeling proud, while servants or people who were less fortunate sat along the edges, shaking with cold. But there is a catch. Even in this big room, the heat only went as far as it did. If you sat further away from the flames, the air got colder and colder until it felt like the walls were breathing out frost. The smoke-filled air rose and rose, trapped in the rafters. Those on the floor wrapped themselves in cloaks and huddled together. The truth is, only a few people were ever warm, and everyone else just pretended to be. One strange thing that historians have said is that feasts sometimes also serve as a way to get people to do something. Nobles planned to have their biggest parties in the coldest months. They knew that the heat from the guests and the fire would make the big hall feel almost warm. Some accounts say that servants were told to stand closer together to keep warm. You could say that feasting was about survival as well as about having fun. But the hall's glow didn't last long. When the party finished, the musicians put away their instruments, and the guests went to bed, feeling a bit drunk. In the end, the fire was allowed to burn low. Red flames could still be seen. It was the last time they stood together against the cold, and the shadows grew long on the stone walls. The warmth you felt during the evening quickly disappeared. Within an hour or two, the Great Hall itself would be filled with cold silence again. Imagine yourself there. You don't want to leave the fire, so you keep standing close to it, letting your hands feel the warmth. Your cheeks are red, but the back of your body already feels the cold creeping in, reminding you of what waits upstairs. The smoke stings your eyes and clings to your hair, but you still dread the moment when you have to climb the spiral staircase to your room. Scientists still argue about whether some castles had better heating systems in their big halls. Some people think that air vents and flue allowed the warmth to circulate, especially in later centuries. Others say this is just wishful thinking. They point out that medieval building technology did not make comfort a priority. Most people agree that the truth is harsh. The room was warm only where the fire was. Even the acoustics made it seem like this wasn't a cozy lodge, but a huge, echoing chamber of power. Every laugh echoed. Every step was louder until the sounds felt too big and cold. When the hall emptied, the silence was very noticeable. It was like being in the stomach of a sleeping giant. One of the most interesting images is the change from one place to another. For example, the walk from the main hall to your bedroom. Imagine leaving the warm glow of the fire, going through a narrow passage lit by one torch. The draft hits you right away. A gust of cold air rushes through the arrow slits and open doorways. Your breath fogs again. The warmth you just carried in your body goes away, as though the castle itself is using it up. The change from a room that was only used for a short time to a place that felt like it was always there. Sometimes nobles stayed in the big hall for so long that they practically slept there. A bench with a high back that was pulled close to the hearth could be used as a bed. Servants or guards often collapsed near the embers of the fire rather than go into their chambers. Sleeping near the fire meant you might get sparks, smoke, and loud noises, but it was still better than the ice stone above. Another interesting fact from the records: travelers often complained more about the journey from the Great Hall to the sleeping quarters than the sleep itself. They said that moving from warmth to cold was like a shock to the body. People said they felt shivers all night after that walk. It's as if the castle itself was punishing you for thinking you might be comfortable. The hall was also dimly lit, which had a psychological effect. You knew that once you left it behind, the night would be long and cruel. The Great Hall was more than just a room. It was a warm, cozy gathering before going outside into the cold. Every time they put out a torch or drained a cup, they were one step closer to the very cold and difficult time they would have to face in bed. Even when the candle was lit, you could see that the comfort was only temporary. The fire that was once very bright is now very quiet, with only a few small flames. A servant moves it without much interest, then stops, leaving the ashes to burn out. The noise of people laughing and eating has stopped. Now, the castle is silent as it gets ready for the night. You climb the stairs, feeling reluctant, with your cloak wrapped tightly around you. The memory of the warm feeling is fading with each step. You can't stop thinking about the bright lights in the big hall, as if it was a dream you wanted to keep having. But your toes are numb, your fingers are stinging, and you know the rest of the night is going to be a battle to keep warm. That short, bright glow was what made people feel better. The tradition of getting together, eating, and sitting round a fire before it got dark again. The castle would have been unbearable, too difficult to live in, without the Great Hall. This let people remember what it was like to feel warm, even if only for a few hours. You go higher into the castle, away from the fading light of the Great Hall, and the air feels different straight away. The fire is no longer warm. It's now cold and damp. The walls are very thick, much thicker than you would see in a typical modern house. Sometimes you are completely cut off from the outside world by a 12-foot stone wall. At first, that seems like it's to protect someone. But here's the irony. Those walls, which had once stopped arrows and siege engines, also kept the cold inside. If you've ever been in a basement in winter, you know what it feels like. The stone keeps the temperature like a memory and feels cold even when the air outside is warm for a short time. In the Middle Ages, builders knew how to make strong and long-lasting structures, but they didn't pay much attention to comfort. As a result, the walls ended up being both strong and long-lasting, but not very comfortable. They're strongholds against men, but not against the weather. Historians agree on one thing. People rarely lived in castles that were warm enough to live in. A fire blazed and smoke curled up, but if you moved just 10 feet away, you would feel much cooler. There are old stories from the 13th and 14th centuries that talk about rich families sitting right in front of fires. They covered their heads with cloaks and stamped their feet to keep the blood circulating. The fire made a bubble of warm air, but the stone around it wouldn't give in. Here's an interesting fact from the travel journals. Some people complained that the walls were so wet. Water collected on the cold stone and ran down in streaks, making the rooms damp and unpleasant. Picture this, you're lying in bed, and you can hear tiny drips hitting the floor next to you all night. This is not the lullaby you were looking for. Sometimes moss even grew on the inside surfaces. You lived in a castle, but sometimes it looked more like a cave. Today's scholars still can't agree on whether tapestries and hangings were actually that important. We imagine grand walls covered in thick, fancy fabrics. But did these fabrics actually keep the room warm, or were they just for show? Some researchers say that they cut drafts quite a lot, which makes it feel warm behind the curtains. Others think this was made to seem worse in later, romantic stories. They say that even the best clothes weren't warm enough to stop the cold air that got in through windows and door cracks. The debate is still ongoing, but it does make one thing clear. People were desperate, so they were willing to try almost anything. Try to picture it now. You go into a bedroom at the end of January. The fire in the hearth is small and maybe burning low. The walls are like cliffs, and they're covered in layers of wool and condensation. You are cold. The bed is in the middle of the room. Heavy curtains are pulled down around it. The air might feel a few degrees warmer, like a little sanctuary from the cold behind those curtains, but outside, the room feels like a stone tomb. The psychological impact was just as bad. People wrote about dreading the cold more than hunger or even illness. Luckily, hunger and illness went away in the end. It was very cold every night during the winter. You couldn't escape it if you lived in a castle. You felt trapped in your own home. Picture this. You're pulling the blanket tight, and you can hear the wind whistling as it comes through the small openings in the roof. Your ears feel hot and your fingers go numb. Even in your dreams, you're haunted by images of ice and fire. The stone walls are solid and unyielding, not like a protective shield, but like a refrigerator that never switches off. And now things will look a bit different. Castles weren't glamorous places. They were very practical, but they made you pay for that protection. You had to give up comfort for safety. Every winter night made you realize that stone might keep you safe from arrows, but it would never keep you warm. The more you think about it, the easier it becomes to understand. Sleeping in a medieval castle was more about fighting the environment than about getting a good night's sleep. The enemy was not visible, but was very cruel. The battlefield never changed. Your room, your bed, your body. You walk across the room. Instead of carpets or polished wood, your boots make a crunching sound against something much more simple. Rushes spread across the stone floor. These were more than just decorations. They were a practical way to make the floor feel more comfortable, soak up spills, and most importantly, keep the floor warm. Documents from the later Middle Ages describe how people renewed their rushes a few times each year, layering them thickly in their best rooms. When they were first put down, they smelled a little of the outdoors like grass and earth, which was quite nice. You might feel like you brought a bit of summer with you. The plants made it softer, hid the noise of footsteps, and kept in as much of the warmth as possible. But the charm didn't last long. As time went on, the smell of the rushes became worse. Scraps of food, ale that was spilled, and bones from the feast got stuck in there. Mice and insects treat the floor as their playground. If you imagine a cozy, natural carpet, you're wrong. By the time winter was over, the rushes were so dirty that a French moralist said it was like sleeping in a muddy field. You notice that these rushes had two purposes. Yes, they trapped a thin layer of warmth, but they also soaked up moisture from the damp stone. This was important in a castle where water was always dripping from the walls. Otherwise, every step would have been across slippery stone and puddles of freezing water. Some old English books that keep track of money and property mention something strange. Sometimes, herbs like lavender, rosemary, and meadow were scattered among the rushes. The idea was a bit practical. Strong-smelling plants made the bad smell from rotting scraps less noticeable, but they also made the rooms feel a bit more comfortable, even though they were full of smoke and damp. Picture this. You're getting into bed and you notice a tiny bit of lavender mixed in with the strong smells of wet wool and wood smoke. It won't keep you warm, but it might make the night a bit more comfortable. Architectural historians are still debating how useful these rushes really were. Some people say that they really did make things feel warmer by putting a layer between their feet and the cold stone. Others say they're mostly just a way of showing that things are neat and tidy, and that most of the heat loss happened through the walls and ceilings. Anyway, the evidence is unclear, so the question remains, were the rushes a real medieval technology that kept people warm, or was it just a messy habit that people thought was traditional? Picture yourself lying in bed while someone puts new rushes on the floor of the room. They make a soft crunching sound underfoot and release a faint smell as they are stepped on. For a short time, the room feels clean and tidy. But you know that by morning, the rushes will have taken in the wetness and the process of rotting will start again. Imagine how overwhelming it would be to have so many different sensory experiences in a bedroom. You might feel the comfort of wool or fur under your sheets, but you can smell old rushes, herbs, and smoke all around you. The floor is covered in crumbs, and mice can be seen scurrying around it. Everything reminds you that sleeping was a necessity for you, not a luxury. But there's also a certain ingenuity to it. These people used simple materials like plants found in the river and fields to make tools to last through the long winter. They didn't think about things like carpets or insulation. They thought about what they could do to make the cold a bit less intense. As you rest in this imagined room, you realize that even the floor was part of the fight against the cold at night. Stone was the enemy, and rushes were like a fragile shield. Every morning, he would ask himself, how long will it be before these two turn against me? You're sitting on the side of the bed now, and you're gently running your fingers over the many layers of cloth that are piled on top of each other. If there was one medieval survival secret against the night chill, it was to wear fabric. People started to wear wool, linen, and fur. They wore these clothes in layers until they looked like a cocoon, not a person sleeping. Records from household inventories show just how important textiles were in medieval life. Linen sheets were the basic material, and they felt smooth and cool against the skin. But they were much less warm than the material that was put on top. On top of that, thick woolly blankets were placed, which were so heavy that some people said they were as heavy as a hound. If you were rich, you might add fur coats, fox, sable, or even bear skins. Nobles spent a lot of money on bedding, both for show and because it was very dangerous to sleep outside in winter. But there's a funny thing in the sources that you might not notice at first. Servants sometimes joked that their masters couldn't move once they were tucked in. They were pinned down by so many layers that it took a lot of effort to turn them over. Picture people wrapped up in 5 or 6 thick blankets, so tightly that they can't move or that they might pull the covers off and get cold. People were happy to give up some mobility for a bit of warmth. Fur is special. It's not just for show, it's also really useful. The fur of the Arctic fox, marten, and sheep all kept you warm and cozy. One writer tells us about a rich lady from Burgundy who refused to travel without her warm bed covers, even in summer, because she was afraid of getting cold at night. We think this is ridiculous, but in a world where drafts are everywhere, to us, it sounds ridiculous. But in an age where drafts can go through every room, it was completely understandable to worry about the cold. A strange custom appears in some homes. Some people thought that sleeping under too much linen was bad for your health. This was because it was thought that linen made the body lose heat. To balance this, they deliberately layered wool or fur on top of each other, creating what we might call a textile sandwich. The idea was that linen cooled, wool heated, and fur trapped all the heat and cold. The theory might not be scientific, but it shows how people mix stories with everyday life. Experts are still trying to work out what these textiles meant to society. Was Wasfer's main goal to survive, or was it mostly about showing off? Wealthy nobles collected lots of fur collars, but poor families could live without them. They used coarse wool instead. Historians disagree about whether furs were mainly used as symbols of power and rank, or if they were really necessary to keep warm in cold castles. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. They were both important for saving lives and showing status. Now, imagine you're lying under these layers of fabric. The wool feels slightly prickly against your skin compared to modern materials. On top of that, the fur feels thick and almost too thick to breathe, but at least it stops the cold getting in. The blankets are so heavy they press you down into the straw mattress. You move a little bit. If it moves any bigger, cold air will get into the cocoon. The air around your face feels warm from your breath. While the rest of you is covered by a piece of fabric, the silence of the room makes every sensation seem stronger. The rustle of linen, the rough scratch of wool, and the faint smell of animal skins. There's something close and basic about it. You are covered in the skins and fibers of the natural world. Every thread and hair reminds you that survival depends on turning the environment itself into armor. That's what medieval sleep was all about. When they rested, they built a stronghold inside a fortress, not with battlements and moats, but with sheets and furs. Every night, you protected yourself from the cold with whatever clothes you had. Without them, even a most beautiful castle room would feel like a church crypt. So, as you lie there in this made-up shell, you begin to understand the nightly ritual. Put on lots of clothes, wear heavy shoes, and hope they stay on until morning. The cold might rattle the shutters, creep through the stones, and swirl around your bed, but inside the blanket of fabric, you had a fighting chance. The bed itself was more than just a piece of furniture. It was designed to make a small, livable space inside a room that would otherwise be hostile. When you pulled back the heavy curtains of a medieval castle, you are not just looking into someone's bedroom. You're entering a small world where people had to survive. Records show that these great beds were very important to the rich. These frames were different from the simple wooden structures used by ordinary people. They were tall and made from oak or walnut wood. The post was tall and often had decorative features. It held up a canopy, which was both decorative and practical. You trapped your own body heat inside by draping curtains down the sides. It made the icy room feel a bit warm. Imagine a medieval tent in your bedroom. Once the curtains were closed, the difference was really obvious. It's cold in the room. The air is full of cold air from your breath, your body, and the thick bedding. The temperature might be just above freezing. Those extra few degrees could mean the difference between a terrible night and a better night. A French duchess traveled with her bed dismantled and packed on carts. Why make things more difficult than they need to be? The bed was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a machine keeping him alive that if you slept in a castle or abbey that you didn't know, and you didn't have your own bedclothes, you would be very cold all night. Some English sources mention a curious detail. The curtains themselves were sometimes waxed or lined with oiled cloth to block drafts more effectively. Imagine pulling those curtains closed. The fabric was heavy and smelled faintly of beeswax or resin. They didn't just block the cold air. They also made it dark, quiet, and gloomy, making it seem like you had some privacy, even when you really didn't. Today, scholars still talk about how well these beds worked. Were they really warm sleepers? Or do later stories make them seem more useful than they really were? Archaeological evidence suggests the curtains were thick and layered, so there's reason to believe they worked. But some argue the warmth was more in your head than in your body. The feeling of being closed in, sheltered, and hidden from the cold cave. The debate is still going on, but one thing is for sure. People thought they were so important that they needed to be able to take them with them. Picture yourself going into one. The bed is not strong enough to support your weight. The straw mattress moves gently, and then you pull the curtain closed. The air feels different straight away. It's still cold, but at least there's no longer any wind coming through the slits. You will find that your breath fogs up less quickly. You feel relaxed as you sink into the soft cushions, and it feels like you might actually fall asleep. The curtain hides the quiet sound of water dripping on the walls, the far-off cough of a servant in the hallway, and even the bark of a dog outside. The room has a faintly musky smell of fabric and fur, which is comforting. You only hear the rustle of your blankets when you move. The room beyond might be huge and unfriendly, but here, in your bed, you've made a cozy place to escape the outside world. It wasn't perfect. On some nights, the curtains would get really stiff where the condensation had collected. On other nights, Smoke from the fireplace drifted inside, making it hard to breathe. Even though there were lots of blankets and curtains, the mattress was still the most important thing for sleeping. What you lay under at night can tell you if you slept well or not. If you woke up feeling sore, cold, and grumpy, it's a sign that you didn't sleep well. In the Middle Ages, there were many different types of bedding, but two of them were especially important: the feather bed and the straw tick. The best choice was the feather bed. Imagine lying in a bag made from goose or duck feathers. These feathers are soft and bendy, and they keep you warm. Feather beds are often listed in inventories from noble estates. They are carefully stored and moved with the household whenever the lord travels. A feather mattress that is well stuffed could be so thick that it would be almost a foot above the bed frame. This would make it feel like a bouncy cushion in a room where you would not normally expect it to be comfortable. Families really liked them, looked after them carefully, and passed them down as special treasures. They weren't just comfortable, they were really comfortable. They showed how important someone was. But there's something interesting. Feather beds can get very hot, so much so that it can feel like you're trapped in your own sweat. This can happen even in winter. There's a funny story from a letter from the 15th century. A guest wrote about his host's bed. He said that the bed was so big that he felt like a goose in a pot. If you had too many feathers, you sank too far. This meant that instead of a gentle sleep, you spent the night struggling to get back to the surface. For most people, the reality was a straw tick. This was a large bag filled with straw, hay, or reeds. It was stuffed until it formed a rough mattress. Farmers, soldiers, and castle residents all used them. They didn't cost a lot, were easy to fill, and worked pretty well at lifting you up off the icy floor. But straw had its own problems. It flattened quickly, poked through the cloth, and often had fleas. Households had to beat the bed regularly. This meant whacking and shaking the straw sack to fluff it up and get rid of any bugs. If it's morning, your body might be itchy from the scratches caused by straw, but at least you survive the night. Modern sources say that if it's morning, your body might be itchy from the scratches caused by straw, but at least you survive the night. Modern sources mention a strange detail. Some people mixed herbs into the straw. This made the straw smell sweeter and kept away pests like insects. Lavender, mint, or pennyroyal might be added to the straw. This left a small smell that hid the sour smell of damp hay. If you have ever slept on a straw-stuffed mattress, you know that the smell never goes away. It lingers, smelling of earth and mold, and gets into your clothes and hair. Experts still don't know how common feather beds really were. Some people say that they were rare luxuries that only the very rich people had. Other records show that most households had at least one feather bed. This suggests that they were more common than we thought. The disagreement is about the evidence, which is not very clear, but it does show that sleeping surfaces are important enough to be carefully recorded. Picture yourself lying on a straw mat in a room with a lot of air moving through it. You can feel the bag making noise as it moves, and it feels like there are lumps under your back. Each shifter emits a puff of grassy scent mixed with the faint, sharp smell of herbs. You hear the quiet sound of mice running across the floor in the bushes, and you think that they might come and see you. The blankets above are heavy, but the straw below reminds you that people were never completely comfortable in this age. Now, imagine a feather bed in a fancy room. You sink down and feel the softness of the down around your body. It feels great at first, but then it starts to feel too hot. The feathers shift, and you find yourself in a hollow that is a bit too tight. You push at the blankets because you want to get some fresh air, but the curtains keep everything inside. You fall back to sleep, safe in the knowledge that this discomfort is still much better than sleeping on straw. The choice between straw and feathers was a sign of one's social status in medieval times. Only the privileged could lie on feathers. If you had to sleep on straw, it was because you had no other choice. Both were reactions to the same problem: how to keep the body alive in the cold, hard stone chambers. If someone invited you to sleep in the same bed or room as them, it was a sign of close friendship or romance. It was a really nice feeling. But there was another side to it, too. Animals. Dogs especially became sources of warmth. The phrase "a three-dog night" may have come from much later folklore, but the idea is based on real events. In the Middle Ages, people often let hounds sleep in their beds. This was because the animals gave off warmth. A couple of big dogs lying at your feet could mean the difference between having numb toes and feeling comfortable. Travelers even said that some inns had guests sleeping in very close quarters with dogs, goats, and even sheep. The smell was very strong, but the warmth was more important than the smell. Experts still disagree about whether bed sharing was common among nobles. Some say it was normal for lords to share a bed with people they trusted, like ladies or servants, or for travelers to share with other travelers. Others say that among the rich, this closeness was rare and controlled. Servants were put in the bed next to the bed, not in the bed itself. However, it is clear that in the lower classes, it was normal for children to share a bed. Families would all sleep together, with parents, children, and often grandparents all under the same blanket. Privacy was not a big deal when people's lives were at risk. Try to picture yourself lying in a bed like this, with lots of other people around. The first few minutes feel strange. The elbows are sticking out. Someone coughs. A blanket is slipped, but the warmth will soon increase. You are wrapped up together in each other's body heat. You can feel the dog's weight on your feet and hear the soft breathing of the people with you. Little by little, your muscles start to relax. The castle may be windy, but inside this building, you almost feel at home. But this had its problems. Fleas and lice spread quickly, and secrets are easily shared in secret. But when you thought about how annoying they were compared to the risk of not being able to sleep, the choice was easy. You chose to be warm and friendly instead of being alone. Some people don't like the idea of sharing a bed with servants, siblings, or animals. But for the medieval sleeper, it was a way of surviving that everyone knew was the best way to do it. In a world covered in stone and ice, every extra person was a blessing. So, as you pull your own blanket tightly around you tonight, think of those people from the past who slept outside and had fewer things to protect them from the cold. Their solution was easy. Share some warm feelings and hope that the night will be kind. Imagine blowing out your candle and getting under the covers. It isn't just the blankets or the bed curtains that will keep you alive tonight. What you wear is also important. People in the Middle Ages often went to bed wearing clothes that were almost as warm as their day clothes. This is unlike today, when people often go to bed wearing only their pajamas or even nothing at all. The clothes became part of the system that kept them warm. We know that people's everyday clothes were usually their nightshirts, because we have found evidence of this in the form of household accounts and surviving garments. A long, loose piece of linen clothing that looks like a big tunic. Linen might not seem like a warm material, but it was the smart choice. It's easy to wash, feels smooth against your skin, and lets your skin breathe. You might want to wear a wool tunic or a cloak, depending on how cold it is. In the Middle Ages, people liked things to be complicated. But there's one thing that really stands out. The nightcap, or coif. These were small cloth caps. They were tied under the chin or simply pulled over the head. Why is the skull so important? People thought that most body heat left the body through the head. If you were a medieval soldier without a shield, you were in great danger because you would be very exposed. Illuminated manuscripts even show figures tucked into bed with their heads neatly wrapped. They look more like they're ready to travel than to dream. The nightshirt can be different lengths. Poor families didn't have much money, so they wore whatever they had. Sometimes They even used their undertunic as a blanket to sleep on. Wealthier nobles had nightwear made with fancy embroidery or trimmed with fur. In a world where it was normal for people to share a bed, it was not acceptable to be half-dressed or naked. Even married couples were often shown in manuscripts wearing caps and long shirts in bed. It wasn't just about getting through the night. It was about being respectful. No matter if you were a lord, a lady, a servant, or a soldier, your nightshirt and cloak were important for both social reasons and for practical purposes. Think about the pace of nights like this. The ritual of dressing up, layering more clothes, tying knots, and smoothing out wrinkles before switching off the light. These days, we think of nightwear as being for relaxing. For medieval people, it was protection from the weather. So, as you pull your blanket around you tonight, think of the people from long ago who got into bed looking more like travelers than dreamers. They were wrapped up in linen and wool, with their heads wrapped tightly against the dark, and it was not easy for them to sleep. It was built stitch by stitch and layer by layer against the constant attack of the cold stone. Picture this. It's just before you go to bed. A servant comes over carrying a pan that has a long handle. The pan is made of brass, and you can see a soft glow from the firelight on its surface. Inside, hot coals crackle and hiss. This makes a noise like ash and heated metal. This curious object was the medieval warming pan. This was a tool that was as simple as it was ingenious. After all, who wanted to crawl into sheets that felt like blocks of ice? The ritual went like this. The servant moved the pan back and forth quickly between the bedclothes and the coals inside, which let tiny holes in the pan send heat through. The sheets of smoke above filled the air with the faint smell of burning wood. For a few minutes, the bed, which had been like a frozen slab, became something that felt almost warm and inviting. If you missed this step, you might feel very cold for an hour before your body starts to warm you up. Lists of surviving items from noble households mention warming pans, candlesticks, and chamber pots. These are everyday tools that people used at night. They weren't uncommon. They were expected. By the late Middle Ages, rich people in Europe used them as a must-have in winter. A chamber without one was either neglected or occupied by someone of low status who did not deserve such a luxury. But these pans were dangerous too. Letters from that time say that the surfaces of the pans got so hot that they turned black or even caught fire if servants left the pan on the stove for too long. Picture this. You're about to hop into bed, only to find a big hole where your sheets should be. There are funny and sad stories about brave men. One of these stories is about a man who woke up in the middle of the night because hot sparks from a pan caught the blankets in his room. His room had wooden roof beams and dry rushes on the floor. Accidents like this were not small. One person from Italy told us a very strange story. They said that they would put strong-smelling herbs directly onto the coals before making the bed warm. People believed that the smoke left behind would make the air cleaner and help to stop diseases spreading. You can almost smell it now. The sweet smell of lavender and rosemary mixing with the strong smell of embers clinging to the fabric as you finally climb beneath it. The belief mixed real-life practical ideas with superstition. It is a fight every night against the cold and invisible illnesses. Even today, experts who study medieval homes still talk about whether the idea that the world was getting warmer at that time was true. Some people say that they were mostly used by rich people because they were too expensive and dangerous for ordinary people. Others say that simpler versions, such as clay pots filled with embers wrapped in cloth, were common among families that were not very well off. The truth is hard to find because such simple things rarely survive. It's clear that people across society used some method of preheating the bed, even if the method was different for each person. Picture yourself watching what's happening in your chamber. The servant moves the pan slowly across the sheets, and steam rises gently as the moisture in the air turns back into gas. When you take the pan out of the oven, the air under the lid is surprisingly warm, which is a nice change from the cold room. You quickly slide inside to trap the heat before it escapes. For a few minutes, the cocoon feels really nice, as if you've stolen a bit of summer in the middle of winter. But it doesn't last long. The warmth quickly disappears and is replaced by the cold of the castle walls. The point wasn't to make you feel comfortable all night. The aim was to make the first moments of sleep easier to endure. When your body was relaxed and you were too tired to keep shaking, it was easier to fall asleep and your body would take care of keeping you warm. The warming pan was a sign that both sides had agreed to a compromise. This won't solve the cold completely, but it'll help. It was a bit like making a deal with the night. If you give me a few minutes to relax, I can handle the rest. As you picture yourself lying there, almost asleep, with the faint smell of the fire still clinging to your sheets, you realize just how important sleep was in medieval times. Every evening, there was a set routine of tools, clothes, and movements. The warming pan was not just for show. It was part of the survival kit. Many nights would have been miserable without it. You are in bed, imagining how nice it would be to have a good night's sleep. You pull the heavy blankets closer to you. Suddenly, you feel something pressing against your legs. A warm, comfortable shape that fits snugly around your knees settles down for the night. It isn't another person. It's a dog, or perhaps two, or even three if you're lucky. It was very common for people to let their animals sleep in their beds. Dogs were especially important as guardians of property and hunting companions. They were heaters. Their thick coats kept them warm, and because they were so loyal, they stayed by their master's sides during the long, dark hours. A castle chamber that felt like a cold cave could become much more comfortable with a few dogs snuggled up at your feet. In the later Middle Ages, wills and household records sometimes mentioned small lapdogs that were given to noble women. These dogs were given for two reasons: to be companions and to provide warmth in bed. That we might call these dogs comfort dogs today. They were treated like pampered pets, brushed and perfumed. But their most important role was to chase away the cold of winter nights. Larger breeds lay stretched out like furry logs at the bottom of the bed, keeping their toes warm and dry. There's even a funny story from Scandinavia about travelers in winter. These travelers asked to sleep in stalls with animals instead of in the cold guest rooms. Horses, cows, and sheep produce so much heat that sleeping near them was better than sleeping alone in a stone hut. Try to imagine the feeling of being close to a cow as it breathes slowly and quietly. The air smells of fresh grass, and your body feels warm from the cow's size. This might not be exciting, but it works. Dogs, however, make you feel special. There's an old French saying that a loyal dog keeps its owner warm and happy. It is both literal and poetic. The animal's warmth kept the body warm, and its presence made the lonely, cold castles feel less lonely and cold. Experts still can't agree on how common this practice was. Some people think that allowing animals in noble beds was frowned upon in formal households. They think that it was seen as a private indulgence rather than a common custom. Others argue that the evidence suggests that it was widespread, especially in rural or frontier castles. They say that in these places, survival mattered more than etiquette. People are debating whether the image of a lady sleeping with a lapdog is an exaggeration or reality. Try to picture the scene clearly. You were wearing your nightshirt and wool blankets, and the curtains were closed. Outside, the wind howls along the castle walls. Your toes are cold, but then you feel the warmth of a dog pressed against them. It has a rough coat and a solid body. It has the scent of the hunt and the outdoors, but you welcome it without hesitation. Another dog curls up next to you, and soon you are wrapped not just in cloth, but in the warmth of a living body. The room might be cold, but in the bed, everything is changed. This meant some problems. Dogs shed hair, dragged in dirt, and sometimes gnawed on bones hidden under the bed covers. Insects traveled with them, spreading to the people with them. It was worth it in the end. It's better to have fleas than frostbite. It's better to have a dirty blanket than to sleep without one. The mix of all the senses is unforgettable. The smell of dog fur, the faint smell of smoke, the heavy weight of blankets, and the steady breathing of another creature. People spoke about their animals with great love and respect, which is not surprising. Sharing warmth meant sharing survival. The phrase three-dog night was coined much later, but it perfectly describes how people slept in the Middle Ages. If you had one dog, the cold was manageable. If you had two dogs, the cold was serious. The third meant that the night was so cold that even nobles brought every possible source of heat into the bed with them. So, as you lie there in your own bed tonight, think of how amazing it must have felt for people in castles made of stone, with cold air coming in and no light, to be comforted by the simple loyalty of an animal curled up next to them. That little bit of warmth from the human helped the dog and the human stay alive through lots of winter nights. Open the curtains for a moment and imagine you are outside in your imagination. In the servants' quarters in the courtyard, another world of sleep begins. The difference between the lives of ordinary people and the nobles was clear, but the goal was the same: to survive the harsh nights. Who actually slept better? The answer might surprise you. Nobles had big, fancy beds with feathers, fur-covered beds, pans to keep them warm, and thick canopies. But being grand did not always mean being comfortable. Their bedchambers were huge, built to be shown off as much as for sleeping, and all that space made it impossible to heat them. Even with roaring fireplaces, the stones soaked up the warmth like a sponge. A lord might be lying on a bed of down and fur, but the air around him would still feel cold and turn into mist before his eyes. At the same time, ordinary people lived in simple wooden houses. These were small, and only one hearth was big enough to warm the whole house. The straw on the thatched roof kept the house warm. Families sat close together, often with animals stabled at one end of the room. The heat from the fire made the air much more comfortable than in a cold keep. A visitor to a 14th century English village wrote that the huts were simple, but they kept the warmth in much better than the Lord's Tower. Status was more important than comfort. Nobles had access to better materials, like wool of high quality, imported furs and linen that softened when washed. Farmers used coarse wool and blankets to make do, or sheep skins, which were left to dry in smoky tents. Their bedding smelled strongly of linoleum and smoke from the fireplace. Although it kept them warm, it never looked or felt luxurious. One interesting thing that we have found out about people from the past is that sometimes peasants would sleep on benches near the fire with their children lying in their laps. They risked sparks and smoke, but the closeness to the hearth made them feel warm. In contrast, the noble's bedchamber, separated from the great hall, often lacked that immediate heat. The comfort was not spread out evenly and not always in the way you might have thought. Today, researchers are still trying to work out what the real hierarchy of warmth is. Did being rich automatically mean you slept better, or did poor people in their small but cozy cottages manage to get through the winter nights more easily? The evidence is mixed. Some scholars say that the large number of textiles made by the nobles was the reason for their superiority. Others say that the smaller, shared spaces of the lower classes provided a comfort that the aristocracy's grand buildings could not match. The discussion is still ongoing, showing how sleep can be a reflection of social divisions. Picture these two scenes next to each other. In the castle, a nobleman is wearing lots of layers. He is breathing in deeply, and the air is moving around the room as it hits the shutters. In the village, a poor family of farmers sleeps on a thin mattress near the fire. Their children are snuggled up close to them, and the stench of animals from the nearby stable fills the air. One bed looks fancy and formal, while the other is more relaxed and natural. But which body feels warmer after sleeping in these beds? The question is still there, and maybe there is no answer that works for every situation. However, there was one thing that both the nobles and the peasants had in common. They got used to it. In the medieval night, it was not about being comfortable, but about learning to live with difficulty. People had to change their homes and their habits until they could rest. Nobles may have shown off their wealth by being very luxurious. Farmers may have relied on closeness and simplicity, but everyone slept under the same winter stars, shivering and dreaming their way towards morning. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you can sense the irony. Who you were decided what you had, but not always how well you slept. Sometimes the most humble hut was warmer than the grandest hall. You might think that once a bed was in a noble chamber, it never moved. These beds were huge, with lots of carved posts and curtains. But in reality, families often moved to a different sleeping area depending on the time of year. The bedrooms were not set up in a way that made them feel like they were always there. They were flexible spaces that were chosen because of how they were affected by sunlight, fire, and wind. To put it simply, you went in search of the sun in winter and stayed away from it in summer. This habit is clearly shown in documents from noble estates. Some castles had rooms for winter and summer, not because people wanted to change where they were, but because the physics of warmth needed them. In winter, families moved into rooms that got sunlight from the south. This way, the sun shone through the windows for a few hours each day. The walls kept a bit more heat in, the air felt a little less cold, and waking up wasn't as hard. When summer came, they left the sunny rooms and moved into the darker, cooler rooms that face north. There is a well-documented example in the accounts of Edward IV's household of beds and furnishings being moved seasonally. Servants carried feather beds, linens, and tapestries from one room to another, creating temporary nests wherever the king chose to rest. It was very difficult, but for people living in stone palaces, it was important to be able to move around to survive. A curious note survives from a courtier in Bengal. He wrote a letter complaining that one year he lost his room to the frost. He said that the walls were so wet and cold that he wouldn't sleep there. Instead, he chose a narrower room that faced the rising sun. The way he expresses himself makes us think about how castles were actually built to be used against people. The rooms were taken over by cold, but then they were given back to the seasons. Experts still can't agree on whether all castles had more than one room used at different times of the year, or if only the most impressive ones did. Some people say that most castles only had a few rooms that were big enough to sleep in. This meant that the people living in the castle had to sleep outside. Others say that the way the windows are arranged, the fireplaces, and the surviving records show that the buildings were designed to be lived in only at certain times of the year. The argument is still unclear, but the image is convincing. It shows a noble family moving within its own walls, like birds changing their nests as the weather changes. Picture yourself doing this every day. In autumn, you start to look at the sunlit side of the castle, knowing that the long nights will soon be here and you'll need every advantage you can get. Servants take your bed apart, piece by piece. They take the frame, the mattress, and the hangings. You can hear carpenters putting up posts in the new room. You can also hear tapestries being hammered into place to stop drafts. When the first frost comes, you will be in a room that lets in a little bit of morning light. The details you can see, touch, taste, smell, and hear are very clear. You wake up to the warm sunlight coming through the shutters, the fresh smell of the woolen curtains, and the quiet sound of servants sweeping the floor in your new room. The shift does not make it any warmer. It just makes it easier to deal with, turning something really hard into something that you can get through. Farmers also moved where they slept with the seasons, but not as regularly. In winter, families might sleep close to the hearth, the fireplace, in one room, and then go to the loft or barn, the attic in summer, where the air is cooler. In castles and cottages, sleep was always changing and was affected by the outside rather than the inside. This shows that people in the Middle Ages did not have the same idea of having a bedroom that we have today. The bedroom wasn't a permanent sacred space, that it was a temporary camp within the larger fortress of stone. People moved beds around, changed the layout of the chambers, and got used to living in a way that matched the changing seasons. The castle was full of life, changing with the light and temperature, and its inhabitants moving around like nomads inside it. This is another fact about sleeping in the Middle Ages. It was always changing, never the same. The fight against the cold meant that you had to be active, make plans, and change your plans a lot. You didn't get enough sleep. You slept wherever you could, whether it was in the sun, the wind, or the damp. And every year, as the earth turned, you started that cycle all over again. Stand by the narrow window of a medieval room for a moment and feel the breeze on your skin. Castle windows were very different from today's homes. They were large holes in the wall and were not protected by glass panes or sealed frames. They were used to protect people from arrows, but they also let the wind in. These openings didn't have glass, double glazing, or insulation. They were just shutters or stretch cloth that kept out rain and birds. Surveys of medieval households show that glass was very rare in many castles. Surveys of medieval households show that glass was so rare in castles that it was only used in chapels or the Lord's private prayer room. Normal rooms had wooden shutters, which were thick planks that could be locked from the inside. In summer, they were open to let in light and air, but in winter, they were closed, and you could hear them creaking in the wind. Yet wood alone was not enough to keep the chill at bay. The room felt cold, and dampness could be felt on the walls. A practical solution was to stretch cloth across the opening. Sometimes linen soaked in oil or wax was used to make the cloth translucent and resistant to rain. During the day, this let a soft, misty light come in, like sunlight through parchment. At night, it made the noise of the wind quieter, but it did not make it completely silent. The fabric moved around a lot, the frame made a noise, and people who slept there had to get used to the idea that their fortress was not completely sealed. A 13th century French household account describes horn windows. Thin slices of animal horn were made transparent and then put into wooden frames. These were a cheaper but stronger option than cloth. They let in pale light and didn't last well in the weather, but they didn't go yellow or bend out of shape too quickly. Try to picture what it would be like to look out through such pain. The world looked blurry, as if you were looking through foggy glass. But the air in your room is just a little bit cold. Experts still can't agree on how often these windows with horns or oilcloth were used. Some people say that these were only found in the richest castles, while most people only had shutters. Others say that by the later Middle Ages, they were surprisingly common in Northern Europe. The evidence is in bits and pieces, but the fact that people were debating shows how desperate they were to create barriers between themselves and the cold. Try to picture yourself in a window like this. The shutter is closed, the cloth is stuck across the frame, and yet a clear line of frost is still visible along the sill. You breathe in deeply as you lean over it. Outside, the snow looks like the moon is shining on it. But inside, you can just hear the quiet sound of wood moving and the wind try to find a way in. Even if you hang your bed curtains carefully, you will still feel the wind. The sounds in this piece are very memorable. Shutters banging in a corridor far away. The fabric is moving gently like a sail in the wind. Servants mutter as they put rags into cracks. Some people put moss or clay into spaces around the frames to keep the cold out. It was untidy, unattractive, and not lasting. But when the temperature dropped below zero, any measure was better than nothing. Farmers living in villages had the same problem. Their houses often had no windows. They just had shutters to close off narrow slits. Some used bladder membranes from animals were stretched thin to let in light. The effect was creepy. The rooms were dimly lit, but the shadows looked strange and distorted, as if you were looking through a veil. At night, though, even these coverings turned hard with frost, making the thin, see-through sheets into brittle ice. For nobles, their situation was very difficult. Their tall towers made them look important and protected them, but also made them very exposed to strong winds. Guests sometimes said that the higher they slept, the colder they felt. A poor farmer might be jealous of a rich lord's money, but not of the sound of a window closing. And yet there was beauty as well. Picture yourself lying in bed one night, with the moonlight shining through the window. The shutters made a cracking noise, and the floor was lit up by a silvery light. The cold was getting in. Yes, it's a poetry of shadows. The shape of the branches against the curtain, the slight glow of snow outside. Medieval sleep was a balance of discomfort and wonder, where even the hardest nights offered moments of fragile peace. So, when you're putting up your own curtains tonight, picture the old windows. They were more like reminders than barriers. They showed that no matter how thick the walls were, the night would still find its way in. Sleep was never about getting rid of the cold completely. It was about learning to live with it over and over again until morning came. You imagine yourself going to the fireplace in a castle bedroom, thinking that you'll be saved by the fire. If there's a fire in a stone room, it must make the room warm. But the truth is not as nice. Medieval fireplaces were very big. Their chimneys were wide enough to fit whole trees in. Even though they looked impressive, they weren't very good at making the space feel warm. It was all down to physics. If the chimney is wide, more heat and smoke will escape straight up. Fire was raging, sparks were flying, and logs were turning into glowing embers. But a few steps away, you could still see your breath in the air. The fire made a bright, warm area around it, but the castle chamber was still very cold. Records from people's homes show just how much wood this required. A single week in winter in a big castle might use up loads of wood. People were always worried about how to look after the forests and how to use the wood. One lord in France said in his letters that keeping his big hall warm had made the woods disappear more quickly than any war. Fires consumed resources, but they rarely made people feel warm and cozy. There are also some funny stories. People sometimes joked that noble fireplaces were big enough to roast an ox, but not big enough to warm a person. What they say is true, but they're being a bit exaggerated. These hearths were impressive, bright, and made the cold stone walls feel less cold, but they didn't really provide much warmth. Some people tried putting iron firebacks, special boxes for storing fire, behind the flames to reflect heat into the room. Others lined the hearths, the spaces in the middle of the fireplace, with tiles to store warmth for longer. But these measures were only part of the solution. They tried to solve a problem that was too big to solve completely. A fire might keep your feet warm if you sat right in front of it, but your back would still feel icy, and your bed might as well have been outside. Scientists still can't agree on how useful castle fireplaces actually were. Some people say that they made rooms feel warm and cozy when they were used with hangings and heavy furniture. This made a system that kept the heat in the room. Others say they were more about status and ritual than comfort, since most of the energy went up the chimney. The truth probably differed from castle to castle, depending on what resources were available, the design of the castle, and the climate. Picture yourself in a room like this. The fire is crackling loudly and making sparks fly onto the stones in the fireplace. Smoke rises up, leaving a faint smell in the air. Your face feels red and warm, but your shoulders are still cold. You walk closer, holding out your hands until they almost catch fire. You go back to your bed in the other room, but the room feels much colder. By the time you get under the blankets, you feel as cold as you would if you were sitting outside. People who lived in the countryside and had small fires to heat their homes often had an easier time. A single fire in a simple cottage heated the whole interior, even though it was smoky. There wasn't much space, but that meant that the flames and bodies were kept warm enough. The grand, noble fireplaces used up a lot of resources, but they made the chambers half frozen. Once again, the grandeur did not match the comfort. But the ritual of the fire was important. It wasn't just about the heat. It was about coming together, about the light, and about the hope that there was still some good in the world. People prayed, shared stories, and relaxed in chairs next to the fire. Even when the warmth didn't reach the room, the glow made people feel safe and gave them a reason to live when they felt so cold and lonely. When you think of medieval night, don't imagine a warm fireplace keeping you warm. Imagine a piece of toast as a metaphor for comfort. The toast is fragile and easily broken, and it only feels warm and toasty for as long as you leave it on the toaster. The hearth was both a performance and a practical tool. The medieval sleeper realized that it was important to be thankful for even the small things in life. You move closer to the warm fireplace, and for a short time, it feels safe. But then we see another part of medieval life: smoke. Fireplaces were not very clean, and they did not work very well. They belched fumes, left soot, and filled the chambers with a haze that stung the eyes and settled on every surface. Keeping warm by the fire meant breathing in smoke every night, accepting that the walls would be blackened, and waking up with ash in your lungs. People who wrote about that time said they were very unhappy about it. One monk in the north of England noticed that his cell was covered in soot from the hearth. This made him cough a lot more than he prayed. Even nobles were not safe. Court records mention women who were upset about ruined gowns and linens that had become discolored from constant smoke exposure. A newly cleaned tapestry can go gray in just one winter. The architecture made things worse. Chimneys were wide, basic tubes without the draft control of modern flues. Smoke didn't always rise neatly into the air. It moved, stopped, and stuck to the chamber. If the wind blew in the wrong direction, it came back into the room, making everyone inside cough. Try to imagine what it would be like to try to sleep, but you can't because smoke is in your throat and your eyes are watering. From traveler's notes, we learn that some people deliberately smeared their walls with lime or clay. They did this not only to brighten the inside of their homes, but also to hide the streaks of soot. The black dirt didn't really go away, but it did make it look like the surface was clean again, even if it wasn't. But the smell stayed with them. It was a mixture of charred wood, damp stone, and burned wool that stuck to bedding and clothes. Experts were not sure how much they could put up with these smoky rooms. Some people say that medieval people just got used to the situation. Their bodies got used to it, and so did their expectations. Others say that even people of the same time would have known how bad it was for their health. They point to lots of complaints in medical books about people choking on air and getting black lungs. Maybe both are true. People put up with it because they had no other option, but they never stopped complaining about it. Now, picture yourself lying in bed after a night like this. Your hair smells of smoke. Your blankets have the strong, unpleasant smell of ash on them. When you cough, you can taste something bitter on your tongue. Some of the light gets trapped inside the bed curtains. Even your little cocoon is still affected by the fire. Your room might have been warmer than before, but it meant you had less fresh air. The peasants were in the same situation. Their cottages often don't have chimneys. Smoke from the central hearth would rise and fill the rafters, slowly leaking through the thatch. Children grew up in houses where there was always smoke. Their lungs went black before they were adults. But people thought it was normal. Some even thought the smoke was good for the wood roof because it kept insects away. Survival and superstition went hand in hand. The experience of all your senses was overwhelming. Your skin prickled from soot particles. Your eyes watered constantly, and the rushes on the floor gathered black dust. Servants swept endlessly, though it felt like their efforts were pointless. Every winter was the same. It was a fight against the smoke and the cold. You knew that if you tried to win one, you would only end up making the other worse. Even though it was uncomfortable, there was no way to live through a castle winter without fire. So people made their peace. They hung smoky tapestries on their walls. They had to deal with coughing. Every morning, they washed their faces. They needed to give up something to feel warm again. The sacrifice was all for the sake of clean air. So as you lie in your modern bed tonight, breathing easily without worrying, think about how amazing it is to have such a luxurious lifestyle. From medieval times when people slept in the warm to the smoky mornings that followed, their dreams were full of the smell of burning wood. Their lives were full of darkness and soot. As the fire got weaker and the night went on, the only light in a medieval room often came from a candle. You might think of this delicate flame as a decoration or as a way to create a nice atmosphere. But for many people, the candle provided a gentle, flickering warmth. One wick wasn't enough to heat the whole room. But in a world where every flicker was important, even the faintest contribution was valuable. In the Middle Ages, candles came in many forms. Rich people burned beeswax, which gave a clean, bright flame and filled the air with a faintly sweet smell. These were expensive and were only used in chapels, at ceremonies, or in noble chambers. Most people used tallow candles, which were made from animal fat. These smoked, spluttered, and dripped with grease. Picture yourself falling asleep to the stink of burning fat, mixed with the dampness of stone and the smell of wool. Yet candles weren't just for lighting. They produced a lot of heat that was close by. If you put one near your bed, you might notice the fabric getting a little bit warm. Some people put a few candles together on stands. This made groups of flames that gave them light and a bit of warmth. It wasn't central heating, but it made the cold a bit less intense for them. There's a story from the 14th century about a noble woman who demanded 12 candles in her room on winter nights. She insisted that only then could she rest. The servants were unhappy about this, but her request reveals a truth. People used light as a heater, even though it didn't work very well. The dangers were clear. Candle flames could easily topple over, and bed curtains made of wool and linen could catch fire easily. Records show that fires have been caused by things being put down in the wrong place. This has sometimes destroyed whole rooms. There's a very sad story from Germany about a squire who fell asleep with a candle on the bed rail. He woke up to find his blankets on fire and almost died. The servants thought he was careless, but he was just trying to feel a little bit warm because he needed it. Experts still debate whether medieval people fully understood the dangers or if using candles regularly made them less careful. Some say that records of burned clothes show that accidents are common, but accepted. Others think that rich people made things less risky by getting servants to check the lights at night. Either way, the balance between danger and comfort never changed. Try to picture yourself in such a room. The fire in the hearth has gone out, and only shadows are left moving along the walls. There's a candle on a wooden stand next to your bed. It glows gently and warmly, like a golden halo, reaching your hands as you pull the covers up tight. You can feel just a little bit of warmth, which makes your face feel less cold. The flame flutters, wax drips steadily down the side, and the faint smell of smoke hangs in the air. Outside, it is completely dark. You listen to the quiet sounds around you, like the sound of the candle being blown out, the wind moving the shutters, and the wax dripping onto the metal. You only see this small circle of light and heat. The candle is more than just a way to see. It's a comforting presence, a gentle companion when a world feels overwhelming. This scene was played out in more simple ways in the cottages and inns. Travelers lit rushlights and read cheap stories next to their straw beds. These burned quickly and in an uneven way, making a hissing and spitting noise, but their faint glow made me feel reassured. Parents lit small lamps to make their children feel warmer and less afraid. Even monks who were very careful with money allowed lamps to burn in the bedrooms because it was safer and necessary. The mix of all the senses was unforgettable. The air smelt of fat and smoke. The walls were covered in soot from being burned for months. The bedclothes were stained where wax had splattered, but people were okay with these problems. Even in the harshest winter, the candle was more than just a decoration. It was a matter of survival. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the flickering light of a medieval candle. It was warm enough to make the body feel rested, but it was dangerous because of the risk of fire. In the Middle Ages, sleep was always full of tension, even in the smallest details. Closing your eyes meant having faith that your delicate flame would persist through the night, maintaining its warmth without losing its strength. If you leave noble chambers and go to a shared dormitory, you will see a different side to medieval sleeping. Not everyone had the good fortune to have heavy curtains, feather beds, and private servants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and servants often slept in shared spaces. These places were not designed to be luxurious, but to help people endure difficult conditions. Let's look at the monastery. The rules of the monastery said that brothers should live simply. This meant that the dormitories were big halls with rows of beds or pallets. The stone floor went on forever, with just a few narrow windows high up on the wall. Each monk had his own small bed, which was often just a wooden plank with a thin pad on top. The beds were very close together, so that one monk could hear the breathing of the next monk. Privacy was not a thing back then, but people were friendly because there were lots of them. People who survived describe how these halls used to echo with coughing, snoring, and the rustling of rough, woolly blankets at night. The air was thick, cold, and damp, but the large number of people meant the room kept more warmth than a room with only one person in it ever could. One person who wrote about it said that the cloister was warmer than the Lord's Tower because the monks lay together like sheep. Life in the military was even more difficult. Soldiers were billeted in castles or campaign encampments. They crowded into barrack halls. Long rows of men stretched across straw beds. Weapons were stacked nearby. People shared blankets and used cloaks to cover themselves. The smell was strong and mix of sweat, leather, smoke, and straw, all mixed together to create a horrible stench. Even the tired people found it easier to get along. Sleeping close to each other helped them make it through the night. There's something interesting in the rules of some nightly orders. Candles were kept burning in shared spaces, not only to provide light, but also to make the men feel better. The glow made people feel warm, even if it didn't actually make it any warmer. The meaning of the flame was as important as its heat. Experts still discuss whether people chose to sleep together to keep warm or if it was just a result of needing to. Some people say that the monasteries thought of it as a way to punish the monks and remind them that they should not be enjoying life. Others suggest that the fact that spaces were shared made them warmer, and that this just happened to match spiritual beliefs. There's the same lack of clarity when it comes to soldiers. Did they share a bed because they were friends, or because the cold made it impossible to be alone? It was probably both. Picture yourself lying down in one of these rooms. You can hear the straw under you crackling as you move. A neighbor coughs. Another one goes around. The sound was made louder by the vaulted ceiling. It smells of smoke and sweat, but the air is not as cold as in a room on its own. Your wool blanket scratches your chin, so you pull it closer to you. You are grateful for the warmth, but you still want to be alone. The rhythm of the dormitory is clear. Snores go up and down like waves, with the occasional snort of a dream. Somewhere, a rat runs across the rushes. The men who see it don't care. The draft of air still comes in through the tall windows, but the warmth of all the bodies makes it less strong. You may not feel comfortable, but you feel safe. You feel safer than you would if you were on your own in a big, echoing stone room. People who were learning a trade or working in a person's home lived in similar conditions. Castles had many rooms that were not used for much. Young boys or girls slept on straw in these rooms, sometimes in spaces under staircases or in storage rooms. They wore cloaks and huddled together, turning simple corners into temporary bedrooms. Unlike nobles, they couldn't order heating pans or feather beds, but they were close by. Their sleeping quarters were smaller and more crowded, so it was warmer there. The feeling you get when you're in these shared spaces is unforgettable. The rough texture of wool against the skin, the strong, earthy smell of bodies pressed together, the quiet sound of breathing, the scratching sound of straw, and the small drip of water from the ceiling. It was not a time of peace, but it was a time of endurance. People did not expect to be left alone. They thought they would survive. So tonight, as you're lying in your own bed, imagine the long corridors of monks singing prayers before turning off the lights, the soldiers falling asleep in rows after the battle, and the servants huddling together in hidden corners. They were warm, not because of the silk or fur, but because of each other. In medieval times, sleeping was about being part of a community as well as being comfortable. Even in the coldest castles, people rarely survived on their own. You have made yourself comfortable in this noisy dormitory in your imagination. But even here, it's not guaranteed that it will be warm. Fires had to be kept going, and someone always had to get up in the middle of the night, walk across the floor, and add more wood to them. People in the Middle Ages rarely slept without being woken up. People woke up a lot, not just because the straw was uncomfortable or because their neighbors were coughing, but also because they had to keep the fire going. Medieval people's body clocks were different from ours. People didn't expect to get 8 hours of sleep. Instead, they slept in shorter bursts, which some scholars call segmented sleep. The first sleep of the night happened after sunset and lasted a few hours until midnight. Then many people woke up. Sometimes they went to tend fires. Sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they checked on the animals or children. They slept for about 2 hours. Then they woke up and slept for a bit more. In the cold months, their job was often to take care of the fire. If they didn't do this, the fire would die out and the chambers would become unbearable. A famous record was made by a doctor from the 15th century. He said that people should use the time between sleeping and waking up to think, talk, or even have sex. To him, this waking period was normal, but to the castle servants shivering as they walked across the icy floors to feed logs into the hearth, it was more like a job to be done. He heard the sound of fresh wood snapping, blew into the flames, and hoped they would catch. A curious custom is mentioned in some rural accounts. Families were given watch duties, especially in big halls. Everyone got up to check the fire one by one. In monasteries, bells were rung at regular intervals throughout the night. This was to call monks to prayer. It also meant that someone was always awake to keep watch and make sure the monastery did not get too hot. Sleep was not a time when we retreated from the world. It was a shared rhythm marked by responsibility. Historians debate whether sleep was divided into segments or just a common occurrence, and whether it was more common in Northern Europe, where winter nights lasted longer. Some people say it was necessary. It was just too dark to sleep. Some people think that it was a cultural habit, not something that was linked to where the people lived. People are still discussing this, but it is clear that looking after the fire was an important part of these nighttime routines. Try to picture yourself waking up in the middle of the night. The room is quiet, except for the sound of snoring. You push the blanket back. You feel the cold air on your skin and look for a log. You crunch your feet on the straw. Your breath comes in big, hot bursts, and your hands sting as you stir the embers that are almost dead. Sparks fly, logs crack, and the room feels warm again. You are happy because you know that your friends will be able to rest for a few more hours without being bothered. The sensory details are unforgettable. The sound of wood snapping, the soft glow pushing the shadows away, and the smell of smoke mixed with the smell of wool. Your fingers hurt, but you feel good inside when you think about surviving the fire. This makes you feel warm and safe when you crawl back under the blankets. The bed feels much warmer. On the other hand, the farmers living in simple houses had a similar way of life. Their hearths had no protective grates, only open flames on the floor. So if a careless sleeper fell asleep, they risked the fire spreading and dying. A family member was always responsible for getting the logs in order, making sure the embers were kept going, and keeping watch. Sleep came in fits and starts, always connected to the heartbeat of the fire. You will see that medieval nights were not just a time to relax. People had to make plans, take care of things, and protect themselves. People got up, went to work, prayed, checked on the animals, spoke quietly to their loved ones, and then went back to sleep. Even in the dark, life went on. It just slowed down with the light from the fire and the breath. Tonight, as you sleep in your warm bed, think about how hard it would be to keep watch in those stone halls. Closing your eyes was never the only option. To sleep was to trust that someone would wake up, put more wood on the fire, and make sure the room was warm enough before it got too cold. You would put the fire out, got back under the blankets, and try to stop yourself thinking about the race. But there was another medieval way to keep warm. It wasn't about being practical, but about wanting luxury. Some people really liked the idea of having a hot bath before they went to bed, like it was something they shouldn't be doing. It was difficult to bathe in the Middle Ages. Heating water needed a lot of fuel, and tubs were big and bulky. It was not common for people to take a warm bath. It was a special event that people often did together. But for those who could afford it, jumping into hot water on a winter's night was like magic. Chroniclers describe how noble women would bathe in wooden tubs lined with cloth, with steam rising in the lamplight. There are attendants ready to give you warm towels. To get out of the bath and then get between the sheets was to feel for a moment like winter was over. A curious record from Paris tells us that rich people sometimes had tubs placed near fireplaces. This meant that when they got out of the tub, they would go straight into a room that was already warm. The air smelled of rosemary or thyme, herbs that had been added to the water to make it smell nice and to help with people's health. For a short time, the skin felt warm, the cheeks were red, and the body felt ready for a peaceful night's sleep. Such pleasures were not common. People usually look for smaller comforts before they go to bed. People often enjoyed a cup of warm ale, spiced wine, or hot mead. The heat made the body feel warm and relaxed. Some people kept stones near the fireplace. They wrapped the stones in cloth and put them at the bottom of the bed. This was like a hot water bottle, and it kept the room warm for hours. One strange story tells of noble families filling leather pouches with hot sand and placing them between sheets. The sand kept its heat for longer than stones did, and it fits snugly against the body. Picture yourself slowly moving your frozen feet towards a warm pouch and feeling the cold gradually go away. It's really clever. When people lived in places where it was very cold, they tried to find materials to help them. Today, historians still don't know how often people used to have these nice things at bedtime. Were they occasional treats for the very richest, or were they also practiced by middle-class families in a more modest form? Some people think that most people had things like hot drinks and heated stones in their homes. Others think they were still seen as special treats. People remember them because they were different. The debate shows that being comfortable was something that people had different opinions on. Imagine you are in this imaginary room. You sit by the hearth as a servant pours wine into a cup. The air is filled with the smells of cinnamon and cloves, which hide the smell of smoke and damp wool. You drink slowly, feeling the warmth spreading through your body. Your eyes feel heavy. Your arms and legs start to feel loose. When you finally get into bed, the blankets feel less tight and more comfortable. Under the bed, a stone wrapped in cloth is warm to the touch. For once, you're not worried about the night. You can really feel and smell everything. The sweet taste of spiced wine, the sound of a log burning, and the feeling of hot stone. You drift off to sleep, your senses are full, and your body feels comfortable for a short time. But here's the truth. Such treats were not strong. The heat went away quickly. The drinks were kept cool, and by midnight, the room was cold again. These rituals didn't provide long-lasting comfort, but they did offer some mental relief and made the constant cold more manageable. So, as you get ready for bed tonight, think about how people in medieval times really wanted to feel warm and cozy. They made smart tools, looked for short-term pleasures, and even turned a hot drink into a way to stay alive. Their nights were not easy, but they were full of smarts. Every time I had a bath, I used a stone to feel the hot water, and I drank a little ale. I was feeling a bit rebellious against the cold. Even after baths, heated stones, or mulled drinks, medieval people never just relied on practical measures. The cold was not just something you could touch and feel. It was also spiritual and supernatural. It was dangerous at night. The air itself was thought to be full of illness and evil. People started using charms, rituals, and superstitions to protect themselves while they slept. People often put amulets above their beds. These could be simple crosses made from wood, small objects said to have special power because of their connection to saints, or even herbs put into little pouches. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were popular choices. People believed that they could drive away not only evil spirits, but also the night air, which was thought to be poisonous. Picture yourself in bed under a blanket that smells nice, with the smell mixing with the smoke from the fire and the wool blanket. Prayers were like a shield. Monasteries encouraged their members to say psalms, short prayers, before going to bed. Noble families often said special prayers, paternisters or amaras, at the bedside. But even ordinary people whispered magic words, which were a mix of prayer and spell, as they crossed themselves to protect themselves from frost or fever. Some people were saying quietly that there were ghosts of children, and they were putting their hands on the children's foreheads to try to keep the night hag away. This is a creature that is said to make it hard for people to sleep. A curious detail appears in a German household manual from the 15th century. People who sleep were told to put things like knives or scissors under their bed or pillow. People thought iron would keep demons and fairies away. These creatures sometimes came into rooms while it was dark. The metal shone a little in the fire, like a silent guard against anyone who might come in. There were also rituals connected to warmth. There was a superstition about keeping frost from biting your toes. It said that you should turn your shoes upside down next to your bed. Another said that if you whisper the names of 3 saints before blowing out the candle, your body heat will stay in the room during the night. We think these are just old-fashioned beliefs. To them, these were as important as an extra blanket. Experts still disagree about how seriously people took these practices. Some people say that charms and prayers were a big part of everyday life and were really important to them. Others say they were more like habits, things people did because they were expected of them, even if they didn't really believe. Either way, the rituals show something important. Sleep was never trusted. It was a weak time. People were often cold, ill, and in poor spirits. They needed to be protected in body and in spirit. Imagine you're lying in a medieval bed. The curtains are closed, the fire is low, and the room is filled with shadows. Above you is a sprig of juniper, which has a sharp smell that fills the smoky air. A small iron knife is hidden under your pillow. It is there to give you comfort. You quietly say a prayer, your voice like a soft, steady rhythm, and then cross yourself before pulling the blankets up around you. The night feels less scary, as if the rituals have created a circle of safety around your weak body. The details you can see, touch, smell, and taste make the experience even better. The rustling of herbs brushing against the roof, the faint smell of iron near your head, the warmth of wool against your skin, and the echo of whispered words. At that moment, people's beliefs about religion, their superstitions, and their desire to survive are all mixed together. Farmers did the same, but with different materials. Instead of religious objects, they hung simple charms, carved wooden figures, knotted cords, or collected herbs from the fields. Parents used to put garlic under their children's pillows. They thought that this would protect them from getting sick and from bad spirits. Animals were also included. Sometimes, people thought that putting cows and sheep in the house before it got dark would protect the household from the cold. Rituals were a part of life for everyone, and were used to help people get through the cold nights. In the Middle Ages, people looked for warmth in their bodies and safety in things they couldn't see. To sleep was to enter a world of mystery, where prayer, herbs, iron, and flame all worked together to fight the long darkness. So, when you get into bed tonight, picture the little things that make you happy, like putting your shoes on upside down, having a sprig of rosemary, or someone whisper your name. They were small comforts, but they were still real. For medieval sleepers, survival was not just about physical strength. It was spiritual armor, made from faith, habit, and hope. Look at the room, not just the bed. Beyond blankets, dogs, or charms, the way a room was built determined how well its occupants could endure the night. Castles were built first to protect people and property. But over time, builders tried to find ways to make the insides of the buildings more comfortable. The result was a mixture of features, some of which were clever and some of which were symbolic. Together, they tried to make stone feel warm. One such feature was the solar, which was a private room often set aside for the lord and his family. The solar was smaller and higher up in the building, and it was easier to heat it. It was not like the big, open great hall. It usually had its own fireplace, thick curtains on the walls, and windows facing the sun. This wasn't luxury in the modern sense. It was a clever tactic. If the room was made smaller, the fire would have less space to spread. Tapestries were used for more than just decoration. Made from wool or silk, they hung on the walls and were filled with color and stories. They showed pictures of saints, hunting scenes, and mythical beasts. They also kept the walls warm. A tapestry might be 10 or 20 feet wide and so heavy that servants found it difficult to hang it up. Behind it, the damp stone was hidden, and the air near the wall felt a little less cold. If you got close to one, you could even smell the smell of wool, which was earthy and slightly comforting. Surveys of archaeological sites show that many chambers were decorated with wooden paneling for the same reason. Oak boards made a barrier, catching air and making the space feel less like a cave. Servants filled in any gaps with tow, moss, or rag to stop air from coming in. The result wasn't perfect, but it showed how far people would go to turn unwelcoming strongholds into places they could call home. Something interesting is revealed in the accounts of the estate. Nobles often took their most prized tapestries from one castle to another, carrying them like walls you can carry. They weren't just art, they were also used for survival. A lord traveling without his curtains was like a soldier without his armor. Even today, experts who study medieval homes still disagree about how useful these architectural features were. Some people think they really did make it easier to draw in air and keep it warm. Others say that the psychological comfort is more important than the physical difference. Going into a room with bright cloth and firelight might feel warmer, even if the temperature is pretty much the same. That debate shows the small difference between how things look and how to stay alive. Try to picture yourself going into a room like this. The door shuts and the wind howls no more. The walls are covered with red and gold tapestries, and in the light of the candles, you can see their woven patterns. There is a fire in a stone fireplace. Smoke is coming up from the fire. The timber ceilings look lower above you than in the Great Hall, which makes the space feel more intimate. It is still cold. You can see your breath in the air, but it seems less cold than in the open rooms below. All these things together make a big impression on your senses. The rough fabric of the tapestry under your hand, the faint smell of wool and smoke, the sound of fire snapping against oak logs. You can almost believe that this room is a safe place, but the cold can be felt just behind the hangings. The peasants did the same thing, but in a simpler way. They didn't use woven tapestries, but instead covered their walls with plaster or wattle. Then they hung coarse wool or patch cloth to keep the cold out. A brightly colored piece of fabric with simple patterns might be used for insulation and decoration. In their own way, ordinary people also made do with what they had to turn bare walls into places where they could live. Another clever design feature was to place bedrooms on the top floors. The heat from the Great Hall below made things a bit cooler. Sometimes children slept in lofts above kitchens, where the ovens kept the air warm. The plan was less about privacy and more about making the most of every little bit of heat. Even though they tried really hard, the cold never went away. You could only reduce the problem, not get rid of it completely. Even so, the presence of wall hangings, solar chambers, and wooden panels shows how much people wanted to change stone prisons into places to live. So, as you rest tonight, picture those rooms full of tapestries, with fires gently lighting them up and wooden floors and bright cloths, making them feel warm and cozy. They weren't comfortable, but they were a show of resistance against the stone, against the frost, against the endless winter night. The medieval household built layers of architecture, art, and psychology to say, this space is ours, and here, at least, we will survive. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of a medieval bedroom. It wasn't like the kind of linen that you see in modern adverts. Instead, it was a stinky stew of odors, which hit you as soon as you walked through the heavy wooden door. To understand how people slept, you have to understand what they smelled, because every breath reminded them of the conditions in which they lived. The first smell was always of smoke. Fires burned almost constantly in winter. Without efficient chimneys, the soot from the fire drifted back into the room. The room went dark, the air felt thick, and the smell became part of the fabric of the blankets and curtains. Even freshly washed linen quickly smelt of ash. At night, you would lie down with smoke all around you, in your hair, on your clothes, and even on your skin. Next, I smelled damp wool. In winter, it was rare for blankets, cloaks, and clothing to be completely dry. Water seeped through the stone walls, collected on surfaces, and soaked into fabrics. Wool has a strong, earthy smell that is also a bit sour and musty. Picture this. You're lying in bed, covering your head and chest with a duvet, and breathing in the fabric, which feels warm but not fresh. To make things even worse, there was the smell of straw and rushes. The floors were covered with them, the beds were stuffed with them, and they rarely stayed clean. They were trampled on by boots, soaked with spills, and full of mice, so the rushes turned musty quickly. Straw mattresses start off smelling of grass, but after a few weeks of use, they start to smell of sweat and rot. Every time a new batch of bread was baked, the air filled with the smell of earth. A 14th century household manual suggested that dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, or meadow mint be sprinkled on rushes to sweeten a room. It worked for a few days. The smell of the perfume mixed with the stronger smell, covering them just enough to seem polite. But soon the herbs wilted and were squashed by people walking past, their smell becoming less strong as the sour smell of old rushes returned. Then there was the human smell. People did not have much access to cleanliness, and they bathed only rarely. They sweated a lot. People slept, wearing lots of clothes that soaked up the smell of the day. Leather, wool, and unwashed skin. The fact that beds were shared by families or groups of friends made things even worse. The air in the medieval chambers smelt of other people's bodies. Sometimes this smelt comforting, and sometimes it smelt suffocating. Experts can't agree on how strong these smells really were. Some say that medieval people, used to being around strong odors all the time, hardly noticed. Others think that people of that time knew a lot, which is why they liked herbs, perfumes, and incense so much. We have proof from old records and medical books that this is true. People said the air was bad, looked for cures, and tried to fix it. The debate shows that smell was not just an afterthought. It was a key part of what it was like to sleep in medieval times. Try to imagine that you are in that room. The fire has burned out, leaving a smoky taste in your mouth. The damp wool blanket is uncomfortable to the touch. Every time you move, the straw under your feet gives off a smell like old bread. The rushes on the floor rustle gently as mice scurry through crumbs. Your companion beside you exhales, warm but heavy with sweat and ale. A faint smell of rosemary, left there a few days ago, is still there, but you can barely smell it now. It's all too much for the senses. It pushes into your nose and lungs and gets stuck in your memory. You cough, move the covers, and try to breathe slowly until you fall asleep. This was normal. This was life. Farmers had the same experience, but to a lesser extent. Their cottages smelt of animals because animals often shared the same buildings. The smell of cows, sheep, and chickens mixed together to create a strong, unpleasant smell that city travelers could not tolerate, but which villagers accepted as part of survival. Even here, herbs were used. You can hang bunches of mint or chamomile from the rafters. This is to make the house smell nice and to keep pests away. Sometimes, perfumes and incense made things better for nobles. The air smelled sweet, though it also smelled of smoke and damp. This was because of the incense that was burning in braziers. The smell of perfume oils on clothes or linen made the air feel lighter. Even the most luxurious room in the world could not escape the basic smell of medieval life. So, when you imagine sleeping in a castle, don't picture nice sheets and fresh air. Picture a mix of smoke, damp wool, straw, sweat, herbs, and animals. Every night, every breath reminded you of where you lived and the hard times you went through. In the Middle Ages, people slept with blankets and a fire, and they also slept with the smell. Maybe, over time, the smell was comforting. Breathing in smoke, wool, and straw made her feel at home. For people who slept in medieval times, the smell was not just annoying. It was a part of every night's dream. People in medieval times had to deal with a lot of problems like smoke, damp wool, and musty straw. But there was another problem that helped them survive the night: food and drink. You might not think that eating a meal before bed is important for sleeping, but what you eat and how it makes you feel actually have a big effect on your body. In winter, people cooked hearty stews made from barley, peas, and root vegetables. These stews were cooked slowly in big pots. These meals made the body feel heavy and full, which made the cold easier to bear. The hot soup made your stomach feel warm and made you think you could stay in a very cold place for a bit longer. A rich family might add meat, spices, or cream to the dish, but poor people only had onions, cabbage, and whatever other ingredients they could get hold of. A 15th century English manuscript suggests that eating at night can help to warm the stomach and ease the cold feeling that comes with death. Whether or not that claim was true, it shows how important it was for people to have a warm diet to survive. A hot meal was more than just a way to fuel the body. It was protection from the inside and outside. Drinks were also very important. Tea was the most common. Everyone, rich and poor, loves it. In winter, it was served warm and gave you lots of energy. Spiced wine, also known as hypocrite, became very popular. It was heated gently and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves that were imported from other countries. Picture yourself enjoying a drink in a smoky room, with the smell of exotic spices mixing with the scent of wool and ash. The sweetness feels like it's burning in your throat, leaving you feeling sleepy and warm. There's even a document from the time of King Charles VI of France. It is a recommendation by the king's doctor to drink hot meat at night to stop the cold from reaching the bones. The idea was similar to our modern habit of drinking tea before bed. In medieval times, however, it was explained using a different theory. This was the belief that warm, moist drinks balance the body's internal fluids. Scientists are still discussing whether alcohol makes people feel warm or just makes them think they feel warm. Some people say that drinking ale or wine makes them feel warmer than they are, even when they are asleep. Others say that these drinks are good for you because they give you energy, especially when you need it most. The truth is probably somewhere between being kind and being thoughtful. Picture yourself getting ready for bed. A servant gives you a wooden cup of moldy wine. The surface is steaming, and the air fills with the smell of spices. You drink the liquid, which looks brightly colored as it moves down your throat. Your body starts to feel relaxed, with your muscles becoming loose and your eyelids feeling heavy. When you finally get into bed, the blankets feel less heavy and more comfortable, as if the warmth is already inside you. For ordinary people, the ritual was easier but still very important. A bowl of hot porridge, made thicker with oats or barley, was what they ate. Families sat around the fire. They ate, and the light made their faces glow. They were ready for a long night. Children licked the last bits of food off wooden spoons and got into bed. They felt warm and cozy from eating something, and this helped them ignore the cold air coming in through the shutters. Many people used to think that if you eat garlic before you go to bed, it can stop you from getting frostbite. People kept using garlic because it was good for their health and made them feel warm. Farmers in cold regions sometimes chewed cloves of garlic before going to sleep. The strong smell of garlic filled the room as strongly as smoke or wool. The world of medieval bedtime food is full of sensory experiences. The bubbling cauldron, the sound of wine being heated over the fire, the smell of herbs and spices mixed with the smell of damp rushes, and a feeling of fullness in the stomach. Every flavor was a way to stop people getting the cold. When you think of medieval sleep, don't forget the supper that came before it. Food was important for keeping warm and healthy. If there was no food, it would feel colder, the blankets would be thinner, and the nights would be longer. The body survived. Every spoonful and every swallow provided another layer of protection. Like an invisible blanket, against the freezing stone around you. Now, imagine the people who are most at risk in a medieval castle. Children and old people are the ones most affected by winter. Their bodies are not as strong as adults, and so they suffer more. If a healthy adult knight or servant shivered through the night, a child might wake up with blue lips, and an old woman might not wake at all. These groups could only survive if they were very careful, got help from the community, and were lucky. Records from noble families show that children were rarely given their own rooms. Instead, they slept in nurseries close to the warmth of kitchens or with servants. Young pages and squires who were going to be trained often slept in crowded rooms together, their laughter and chatter muffled by blankets at night. The logic was simple. There were more bodies, which meant more heat. Babies were wrapped in lots of layers of linen and wool. A cradle was often placed near the mother and, in some cases, directly inside her bed. This kept the baby warm and protected it from the cold air. A story from a 14th century book tells us about a noble child who was laid in a wicker crib wrapped in furs and covered with a canopy. The detail shows how far families would go to protect their youngest children. But even so, many people died from illness and cold. In the Middle Ages, parents were always afraid that their children might be taken by a storm in the middle of the night. Older people are also at risk. Weak bodies produce less heat and could not handle as many drafts. In the past, grandparents often slept in the warmest part of the house, while younger adults slept in the coldest part. In olden times, people put their old relatives in small rooms, or even in the kitchen when it was really cold. A curious letter from Burgundy tells of an old lady who insisted on sleeping in the bakery's oven. She said that the oven was still warm, and this made her feel young again. Medical books from that time often suggested special ways to treat old and young people. Doctors suggested that people use heated stones wrapped in cloth and placed at their feet, or that they make drinks to strengthen their bodies. They said that if things suddenly got really cold, it could be deadly for these groups, which shows how easily these people could be killed. Experts are still debating whether medieval families treated children and older people very well, or just did what they had to survive. Some people say that the focus on protecting them shows great kindness. Others say that the number of deaths remain high, which suggests that families cannot do as much as they would like to. The way people think about age and childhood is affected by the tension between care and inevitability. Try to picture this. It's a winter's night, and you are in a simple country cottage. A baby is wrapped up in a blanket. You can barely see his little face. Grandmother snores gently. A baby is wrapped up in a blanket. You can just about see his little face. Grandmother snores gently. Grandma is snoring gently by the fireplace. The fire is sending soft, red light on her cheeks. Parents tuck their cloaks over their children's heads so that they can keep the warmest air in. A group of children are sleeping on a thin mattress. They are laughing and having fun. The room smells of porridge, smoke, and wool, but you can still feel the warmth of family togetherness. In a castle, the image is different but just as clear. A nanny is rocking a cradle close to the fire and humming quietly to herself. At the same time, a child is crying against the cold. Upstairs, an old noblewoman insists that her bed curtains be drawn tightly, while a servant puts hot stones at her feet. She quietly prays, holding a rosary, scared of the cold spreading its reach. In both worlds, the youngest and oldest people need the most attention, and sometimes even that isn't enough. The details you can see, hear, and smell are amazing. You can hear the logs crackling as they are added to the fire. The soft sound of swaddling cloth rustling. An old man's movements as he gets out of bed and under the blankets. You can feel how fragile everything is, as if the cold is waiting for a chance to hit you. When you think about sleep in the Middle Ages, remember that it was not the same for everyone. Children and old people were at the greatest risk. Whether they survived or not depended on whether other people provided them with warmth. In those long nights, every blanket, every person, and every whispered prayer was important. They remind us that medieval sleep was not just about each person's strength, but about the community. The young and the old were kept warm in winter by the care and attention of those around them. The cold was so bad it made the skin and bones feel like they were on the outside. It changed how people thought about health. In the Middle Ages, chill meant more than just feeling uncomfortable. It was dangerous. It could make the body's insides go wrong and cause disease. In this era, medicine was based on the idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors think that temperature is really important for keeping those fluids balanced, that if it's too cold, your body's natural fluids can become solid, which can make you sick. Old medical books from the 1300s and 1400s give advice on how to deal with this problem at night. One old remedy was to rub feet with warm oil before bed to open the pores and get rid of the cold. Another recommended way to use milk is to add honey to make it warm. This is said to make you feel better and stop you from feeling sluggish. Doctors thought that warmth was a type of medicine. They prescribed heat in every form: food, drink, clothing, and even proximity to others. A French surgeon once said that sleeping in damp rooms can make you sad. He said it was because of a black liquid that can build up in the body. He suggested that tapestries should be hung not for their beauty, but because they were needed for medical reasons. Picture this. Your doctor tells you that not decorating your walls properly could make you depressed. It shows how climate and medicine were closely connected. At the same time, many people used faux cures. Some people believed that rubbing garlic or onion on the bottoms of their feet before bed would stop cold from getting into the body. Others tied charms made of wool soaked in wine around their wrists. An old English herbal, a book about medicinal plants, suggests that keeping a live rooster in the bedroom can protect people from colds. We don't know for sure if people actually slept with a rooster in their bedroom, but this shows how desperate people were for cures. Even today, doctors still don't know how well medieval treatments for colds actually worked. Some people think that oils, heated drinks, and herbal remedies helped a little. They helped blood flow and made people feel better. Others say that most of these treatments were just a way to make people feel better, and they didn't actually work. People still don't agree. But one thing is for sure, people really believed in the power of these nighttime rituals. Now, picture yourself getting ready for bed following this advice. You sit by the fireplace while a servant rubs warm oil into your feet. The room is filled with the smell of rosemary. You drink a small cup of hot wine mixed with honey and feel it coat your throat. A sprig of garlic is placed near the bed. It is strong and strange and is meant to protect against frost. You get into bed, sure that these treatments will stop you from feeling too happy or too sad until morning. The experience of using your senses is very strong. The feeling of oil on your skin, the taste of honeyed wine, the strong smell of garlic in the air. Everything reminds you that sleep was not just a fight against discomfort, but a medical practice and a way to treat yourself every night to help keep your body balanced. Farmers also had their own ways of treating illnesses. Women made herbal teas using nettle or chamomile for children. They thought that the warmth would stop coughs. Men wrapped their legs in wool soaked in vinegar to help keep blood circulating. In the cottages, these practices made it hard to tell the difference between superstition and science. But they gave people power in a world where illness was often unavoidable. It's funny, but many illnesses actually came from the very things used to treat the common cold. Fires filled the lungs with smoke, heavy blankets caused joint pain, and oily ointments attracted dirt. In medieval times, it was better to cough in a smoky room than freeze in a clean one. This is because the cold was a bigger danger than the risk of frost seeping into the body. When you think about sleeping in the Middle Ages, remember that it wasn't just about putting up with discomfort. It was wrapped up in ideas about health and treatments, some of which were strange and some of which were familiar. There was also a constant worry that a cold might have serious consequences. Every night was a medical event. Everything was prescribed, every herb was a treatment, and every time you fell asleep, you trusted that these efforts were enough to carry you through until morning. Even with fires, blankets, herbs, and charms, there were nights when none of it was enough. If you go into a castle room in the middle of winter, you might see something strange, frost on the walls inside. Picture yourself in bed, noticing a delicate lace pattern. Picture yourself in bed and see a thin layer of ice on the stones, or wake up to find your sink completely frozen. The water inside became a mirror-like surface. The cold weather didn't stay outside where it belonged. It came inside and made things very cold. People who write history have recorded times when whole families woke up to find frost on their bed curtains. One noblewoman wrote in a letter that her canopy, a type of outdoor clothing, glittered as though it had been sewn with silver. This meant that the moisture from her own breath had turned into little silver crystals overnight. We think it sounds like poetry. To her, it was a sad example of how even a well-furnished room could feel empty. Archaeological evidence backs up these stories. In some old castles, there are faint lines of salt and stains from moisture. These show that water had collected on the walls and floors. If there is no insulation, warm air inside a building will meet cold stone and frost will form. Every morning, servants would scrape ice away, but every night it would come back again. There's an interesting story from Scandinavia. In some halls, icicles had formed on the rafters inside the buildings and were dropping on people who were sleeping below. Servants used cloths to collect the meltwater, which was a basic way of dealing with the problem. Picture yourself drifting off to sleep and hearing a slight sound of ice breaking above you. You wonder if a piece of ice will fall onto your bed. Scientists are still talking about how often this happened. Some people thought that frost indoors was normal only in Northern Europe, where winters were colder. Others say that even in areas where it's not very warm, stone rooms that are not well heated can get very cold. The truth might be both. The danger of finding ice in your room was always possible, and how bad it was depended on where you were. Try to imagine yourself in that situation. You wake up when it is still dark outside, and the air is full of mist. The bed curtains are stiff and covered in frozen crystals. When you go to get water from the tap, your fingers feel ice instead of water. Your joints hurt from the cold, and the thought of getting up and leaving your warm bed feels like a punishment. You can really picture it. The cold, sharp sting of frozen fabric against your skin, the brittle creaking of which shrunk by frost, and the silence broken only by the faint sound of melting ice. Farmers lived with the same problem, but in different ways. In their small houses, ice would build up on the roofs and rafters during the night, and sometimes this ice would fall on the people's hair when they woke up. Parents laughed and joked about sleeping with the clouds indoors. Even so, humor could not hide the difficulty. After that, it was very cold, people got chills and coughed a lot. Even though nobles were rich, they couldn't escape it completely. Hot stones and furs kept the body alive, but the air outside was still very cold. Diaries suggest that people felt very worried about having to get up in the morning. They felt like they were trapped under blankets because they did not want to face the outside world. One English poet even used this idea in a metaphor. He wrote about love as a bed without frost inside the covers. For him, true intimacy meant facing the nightly chill and creating warmth where there was only ice. It shows how the experience of imagination, as well as reality, is affected by frost. So, when you think about sleeping in the Middle Ages, remember how cold it was and how strange it must have felt. If you lived in a castle, you would have to share a room with ice. Every morning, you would wake up and remember that stone and frost were your enemies. People kept going, getting rid of ice, putting on more blankets, saying prayers quietly, and facing mornings that felt as tough inside as they did outside. Now, imagine you're not in a castle, but on a journey, far from the comfort of your home. Travel in the Middle Ages was slow, difficult, and dangerous. It got even colder at night. Castles had fireplaces and tapestries. Farmers had their own homes, but travelers, religious visitors, traders, and fighting men had to find somewhere to stay wherever they could. This usually meant in castles. The medieval inn was not as cozy as you might have thought. Instead, it was often a wooden building with a smoky entrance hall, crowded rooms, and beds shared by people who were not related. Guests might be squashed together on a bed, with only thin blankets to cover them and no privacy. However, insulation is very important because it stops heat from escaping. The huge fire in the main hall made everyone feel warmer as they huddled together. One traveler in 15th century Italy said that the beds had insects on them, but he was glad that he didn't freeze because the other guests were there. Imagine getting into a straw mattress, squeezing next to two strangers, and smelling ale and sweat. It was unpleasant, but at least your toes survived the night. There were some strange places to stay, too. Some inns were so poorly equipped that guests had a hard time sleeping. At first, this seems bad, but sometimes travelers liked it. Horses and cows gave off a warm feeling, and a stable full of animals was much cozier than an upstairs room full of cold air. People walking the Camino de Santiago sometimes wrote about choosing stalls on purpose, curling up against hay bales with animals. They said that their breath mixed with the animals' breath. The smell was strong, but the heat was definitely there. In more rural areas, people welcomed visitors in the traditional way. People thought that villagers would welcome travelers, especially pilgrims or people carrying religious items. A poor family might let you sleep outside on a straw mat by the fire. It was the generosity and closeness that made this place feel warm, not the luxury. You would sleep close to other people you did not know, listening to the sound of a fire and the smell of stew. A 14th century French town has left us with an interesting record. It talks about inns that were shared by many people. These inns had long wooden platforms covered in straw. Dozens of travelers would lie side by side, men and women all together. The idea of people being forced to stand close to each other might make us feel uncomfortable now, but it was normal in the past. They all felt warm and friendly, and this was more important than any awkwardness. Experts debate if such inns were more comfortable than castles. Some people think that even though they were crowded and dirty, they kept the heat in better than big, fancy rooms. Others talk about the dangers of lice, fleas, and theft. They suggest that castle life, even though it was cold, was safer than other places. Both views are valid. If you were a medieval traveler who was tired, you might have had to choose between two very difficult options: staying alone in a cold place or staying in a crowded place where you would be very uncomfortable. Picture yourself in one of these inns. When you go into the hall, you can hear lots of people talking and the sound of fire. You can smell the ale, smoke, and roasted meat. You get on a straw pallet, which is cleared, and then you squeeze in next to other people. The floorboards creak, dogs bark, mugs clatter, and yet the warmth of the crowd makes your limbs relax. Later, when the hall is quiet and people are snoring instead of laughing, you can feel the heat of bodies pressed close together, and the embers of the hearth are gently glowing. It's not as comfortable as you're used to, but it's good enough. The details you can see, touch, and taste are amazing. The sound of a straw being pulled out of thin linen, the strong smell of sweat and smoke, and the regular breathing of a dozen sleepers. You move slightly to avoid disturbing your neighbor, and eventually the quiet sounds of the inn make you fall asleep. Even nobles had to face this when they were traveling. Royal progressions required large groups of people to go with them, and these groups grew quickly. Records describe monarchs staying in monasteries or taking over whole households to be part of their groups. But even kings couldn't get around the basic problem. There was little warmth, and the road took away the traveler's advantages. So, in the story of medieval sleep, remember the traveler. He never knew what he would find in the bed he slept in every night. It might be a bed with fleas, or an unstable bed with horses, or a stranger's floor, or, if he was lucky, a monastery guest hall. No matter where it was, the same goal was still there to trap enough warmth to see another day. Every household found a way to survive, but not everyone did well. The medieval world left behind stories that were half history and half legend. These stories were about people who faced nights so cold that they became the stuff of cautionary tales. Sleeping in a castle was like fighting an invisible enemy, and sometimes an enemy that was cold. There is a sad story from the 13th century about guards on a castle wall in Flanders. They were so cold that they couldn't move during a very cold winter attack. By the time the sun came up, their friends found them standing up with spears in their hands, and their bodies were stiff with ice. The chronicler did not see it as a tragedy. He saw it as proof of how cruel winter was, as though the cold itself were a weapon of war. Picture the creepy sight. The men became statues all of a sudden, and their watchfires were put out. There are also gentler, more personal stories. A woman from Burgundy wrote a letter. She said that her cousin from Italy was very scared. He was shaking all night. He wanted the morning to come as soon as possible. He had never seen such cold weather. The man survived, but the story was told again, with people laughing and making fun of him for being weak. At the same time, they quietly admitted that they too were very scared during the long, scary night. There's a curious old story from Scandinavia about a bride. She went into her new husband's castle, but she was so shocked by the cold room that she fell down. People living in the village said that she had been put under a curse by the ice spirits of the north. No one knows whether she died from an illness or just from being out in the cold too long, but her story was important because it was a warning to other people. Even marriages between noble families could be tested by strong winds and storms. Scholars still disagree about how seriously we should take these stories. Were they made to seem worse than they really were, just to make the story more exciting? Or do they show how bad frostbite and extreme cold can be in a time before we had things like insulation? Some people think that chroniclers told exaggerated stories to teach people about right and wrong. Others think that they just wrote about a time that was much harder than the present day. Picture yourself in a big room, listening to stories being told. The fire is spreading slowly. Shadows dance on the walls. There's an old story about a knight who died in his sleep because he didn't have enough blankets. Children listen, looking very interested and holding their cloaks tightly. These stories are entertaining, but they also give us a warning. If you don't take the cold seriously, it will take its toll on you. Sometimes, people who travel for work were a bit cautious about this. Pilgrims wrote about friends who died on mountain passes. Their bodies were found in the spring, curled up as if they were still asleep. Soldiers on campaign described their comrades as those who never got up from their beds, their cloaks stiff with frost. When it got really cold, the line between sleep and death became too blurred to tell the difference. Nights like this are scary. The feeling of frost on your skin. Then you start to feel numbness in your fingers and toes. The fear of closing your eyes and never opening them again. Going into a freezing chamber was risky. People could lose blankets, fires, and prayers. The most important thing was to survive. But along with these sad stories, there were also stories of people who kept going. Farmers lived in simple houses in the countryside. They survived the winter by staying close to each other and using fire to keep warm. In the middle of the year, nobles held parties and feasts, showing that they had enough money to enjoy the season. For every account of loss, there were voices saying that people could be strong and that surviving was a kind of winning. Maybe that's why people still believe in legends about knights that freeze. They told listeners that even though castles were very strong, they weren't invincible. Stone walls kept out armies, but not in winter. Even the most powerful ruler needed blankets, fires, and friends to keep them company in the long, dark hours, just like the poorest person. So, as you imagine medieval sleep, hold both truths together. This means the stories of those who died from the cold, and the quiet successes of those who survived. Every story had a lesson. Respect the night. Make sure you are prepared for the cold, and don't take it for granted that you will survive. You finally came back to the fireplace. The symbol was like a beacon, guiding every medieval sleeper. The fire was never just something you used. It was the most important part of the family home. The line between life and death on winter nights. The light cast shadows on the walls, moving like guardians as the flames rose and fell. If you slept in a castle, it was like living in a constant battle with fire. You were scared of it. You needed it. You would not be able to survive if it were not for it. The fire in the hearth was very noticeable. The sound of the oak logs burning was like a heartbeat in the room. Little bursts of flame shot up into the air, leaving behind them thin lines of light before they disappeared into the chimney. There was a strong smell of burning resin, and it was present in the tapestries and hair. Your face felt the heat, while your back felt the cold. The heat came in waves that weren't the same everywhere. The hearth was a strange thing. It saved people, but also made them suffer. It gave people life, but also made them breathe in smoke. Nobles celebrated fire because it showed how important they were. A bright fire was a sign of wealth. It meant that a person could order their servants to gather fuel, to cut down trees if they had to, and to keep the flames going all night. Some families even had servants whose only job was to make sure the fire did not go out. It was more than just an inconvenience to let the hearth grow cold. It was embarrassing. Even the poorest people gathered around their simple fires and showed the same respect. Poor farmers sat on the floor with their families and animals, watching the flames lick the rough wood. They laughed, told stories, prayed, and shared bowls of stew. They didn't have fancy stone hearths, but they were still just as cozy. Fire was important for keeping people warm and safe at night. People would gather around it in both castles and cottages. A traveler in Germany wrote about a curious custom. They said that villagers would gather around a fire and stretch their hands towards it before going to bed. They would whisper blessings into the flames, as if they thought the flames were holy. They believed that the fire would keep them safe and protect their hopes as they slept. It shows how something that was really useful became a custom. Fire was important for keeping warm, but it was also a symbol of spirit, memory, and faith. Historians still can't agree on whether this respect was based on practical needs or just tradition. Some say it was a way of survival, but it was also based on custom. Others say that fire was a real part of spirituality and that it was a force that was part of the world and people's daily prayers. Maybe both are true. In the Middle Ages, people lived close to danger. This meant that fire was more than just something to cook with. It started to mean something. Now, imagine yourself in your castle one last time. The bed curtains are closed and the blankets are piled high on the bed. The wind is strong outside. Snow hisses as it hits the shutters, and the night feels very heavy and dark. But in the fireplace, the embers are still glowing and their dim light is coming through the gaps in the curtains. You close your eyes and hear the sound of flames, but you know they're the thin line that stops the frost from spreading. The experience of all your senses is finished. You can still taste the smoke on your tongue, the weight of the wool and fur on your chest, the feeling of a dog lying next to you and feeling warm. You are quietly saying a prayer. You drift towards dreams, knowing that sleep in the Middle Ages was never easy. People never knew when they would sleep, but they fought for every opportunity to do so. They used every trick, ritual, and bit of warmth they could find. Castles were built to protect people from attack, but they could not protect them from the winter weather. The people who survived did so because they were resilient, inventive, and a close-knit community. To survive the night, they put on lots of blankets, huddled together to keep warm, burned fuel, and kept on hoping. In the freezing cold of the medieval night, people themselves became the true fire. Now let's slow down a bit. Picture the members as if they are gently glowing. Their light no longer fierce, but soft and warm, like coals that have finished burning after a long time. The room is quiet. You can hear the wind outside, but it is getting fainter. You feel the weight of the blankets as you are pressed down onto the mattress. The struggle of the cold, the constant watchfulness of fires, and the noise of dogs and servants. It all fades away, as if you had pulled a curtain across the world. You start to breathe more slowly. Every time I breathe in, I can barely smell smoke and wool. Every time I breathe out, the smell disappears into the still air. The sounds that used to be loud, like footsteps on stone, shutters rattling and monks singing, are now just faint memories. The castle itself looks like it is sleeping. Its stones seem to be silent, like they're keeping a secret. Imagine you are safe and cozy inside your cocoon. The dog at your feet breathes out and moves slightly. The last candle is put out and it gets dark. It's still cold, but you don't fight it anymore. You accept it like those before you did, knowing that sleep is only temporary. As the night falls, your body becomes heavy. Your thoughts become shapes and colors. The medieval world, with all its cold and smoke, feels far away, like frost melting in the sun. There is only calm left. You are warm, safe, and tired. And so the story ends. The fire in the fireplace goes up and down. The bed holds you tight, and the long night gently carries you into dreams. Now, rest as they did in the past, wrapped in quiet strength. Sweet dreams.